With that, I'm going to introduce the speaker tonight. It's Calloway. He's been here at the University of Montana for 4.5 years, and he's a professor in the organismal biology and ecology part of the Division of Biological Sciences. He has been working with plant-plant interactions, so what plants do to other plants, he tells you. Mostly his research has been locally on sentinel, but obviously there's a lot of similarities with the work on jumbo. His background is a PhD at UC Santa Barbara, and then he did postdoc work at the University of Illinois. And I did want to mention that many of the faculty that are contributing to this course are doing so as part of their community service. And so if you're appreciating the fact that faculty are doing this, please thank George Dennison, so he'll understand that that's something the public and the local community really wants, because I think it's going to be their job. With that, I'll introduce Ray.
I have a few goals that I'll tell you about that I want to do tonight. But before I do that, I want to mention that I welcome questions and interruptions anytime. I have sort of material planned for what I sort of guess will go for the time period, but if I don't do it all, it doesn't matter. So I really do want to encourage questions and discussion instead of me just talking at you guys. So these are my plans, what I want to try to do tonight. First, at the beginning, I'm not really going to focus just on jumbo. What I'm going to try to do is take sort of the grassland, the community, the type of vegetation that you see on jumbo, and put it into a broad context in North America and a little bit in the world. In other words, grasslands in general. Where does jumbo fit into this whole thing?
And then I want to talk a little bit about what grasses do that are a little bit different than other plants. In other words, what may give them advantages in this sort of environment, either the physical habitat, the climate, soils that they live in compared to other plants. And then I'm guessing maybe right about that time, maybe we'll stop and break. And then I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about the way invasive weeds, some really weird ways that invasive weeds, particularly knapweed, Centaurea maculosa, interacts with native plants up on jumbo and sentinel and probably a lot of other places, and how it's able to create these, or possibly how it's able to create these monocultures. So first what I want to do is to start off, try to put this little intermountain grassland community here on jumbo into a broader context and show some slides and talk about grasslands in general, mainly in the United States, but a little bit around the world. I think I'm going to have to shut this because it'll be too light. So, depending on who you talk to, there's maybe 8 to 12, maybe 14 biomes, what are called biomes in the world. And these are sort of a typical, a unified, similar type of vegetation, and it would include the animals too, that's very roughly similar in morphology or its shape. The organisms in it or the plants in them kind of look alike. So you sort of have a tropical forest biome and eastern deciduous or mesophytic deciduous biome and so on. And grasslands are one of these. And globally in North America, it's the largest of all the biomes, and although it looks sort of boring at first glance, they're really very important and very, very productive. Physiognomy or the morphology is simple, annual and perennial herbaceous plants. But when you look around the world, the grasslands around the world, you can pick out sort of repeated patterns of morphology. And I'll show you some examples right now, and you guys, I'll put some slides up here, and you guess sort of where we are. See if I can illustrate this reasonably well. So what do you think? No. California. Okay, yeah, annual grassland, although it is kind of cheating because it shouldn't be annual grassland, but it is now because of disturbance. Yeah, okay, all right. So this isn't totally grassland, but I mean, that's kind of a typical grass. Okay, where's this?
Spain.
Okay, it's Spain. Have you seen this before? Okay, you can't. It's Spain. It's Spain. It's Mediterranean grasslands. And actually, this is a little bit cheating because the grasses that you see in Spain, in this grassland here, this annual grassland, which I'll come back to and talk about a little bit, are actually the same because California grasslands are no longer what they used to be. They're now, with very small exceptions, all dominated by European annual grasses. But I mean, here's this sort of climate-determined, Mediterranean climate grasslands, climate-determined patchiness in grass, are repeated appearance or morphology in grasslands. So again, they may look kind of boring and similar at the surface, but not. Okay, where's this? No more. What? It's the front. This is the front. This is getting up pretty close up to the Theater Memorial Range. And actually, go ahead. In case nobody knew that was the front, I had a hint slide. Go ahead. There, so now you know it's a front. Right, and this is a good example, and I'll come back and talk about this a little bit, a good example of sort of classic prairie grassland, short grassland, a little different than what you see in Illinois, but again, covers a large part of North America. Now, if anybody gets this, I don't know what I would do. I can't give an A in this class, but I mean, you got to guess. Nobody will guess this. Yeah, you got to guess where this is now. And this is amazing. Now, here's mountains in the background creating rain shadow, much like the front. Okay, same doggone genera in here. Matter of fact, very. No. Yeah, it's near these are the Caucasus Mountains, or the foothills in the background. And this is at the border of Europe and Asia. Okay, so, and it's very, very similar to what we would call our shortgrass steppe or shortgrass prairie, but it's in a completely different part of the world. Shares similar genera. Festuca is there, Calloway is there. I'll talk about this at the end of the talk. Okay, so again, similar morphological patterns. I think I have one more here. Go ahead. Too dark. What's that? Where's this? Everybody knows where this is.
My backyard, no.
Then you know, you're probably not far. Where do you live? What's that? Okay, well, you're about 50 miles or 40 miles off or so. This is a big flat. So this is our Missoula Valley here. Where's this?
Nevada?
Nope.
Colorado?
Nope. I got a hint. Don't turn. I got a hint. You guys will never get this one either. You only got it, Jock, because you. What's that?
Not Africa.
No. Actually, that wouldn't be bad though. It's very tropical grasses. We don't have a compare. No. Go ahead. Go. Click again. Click. Okay, now where? What? Boy, we need. Okay, here's the hint. Like right. Oh, I can't reach it. No, you're getting closer. Mongolia, yeah, and I can't find the perfect slide, but I mean, it's amazing. I have about 5 slides. I've never been there, but I copied them, and it looks just like the Intermountain grassland of Montana, and shares, again, a lot of genera. Not many species, but a lot of genera. So we sort of have this broad grassland biome around the world, but it's really divided up into some general types that I'll talk about actually right now. And I think this is an old projector, so it won't work. You're going to have to turn it on and off, too, because it doesn't black out in between, so you have a lot of work to do. There are 3, these are types of grasses. It's hard to know exactly how to outline this as I present this to you, but there are 3 basic types of these grasslands, and then we're going to divide it up sort of regional beyond this, but somewhere I've got to mention this. Turf-forming grasses, like we saw there on the east front, as you go beyond, past the Rocky Mountains, down into the prairie, you get grasses. Bunch grasses are still there, but there's far more turf-forming grasses, or grasses that grow stems, other stems, rhizomes, through the soil, okay, and spread out through the soil, create this mat, and then put up many, many shoots. It's hard to know what's an individual. And the farther you move east, and I'll mention this again, in North America anyway, getting closer to the eastern deciduous forest, that growth form takes over completely. Bunch grasses like we have here we use the word steppe, some, and it's from stipa. I mean, it's a Russian word, and their steppes are dominated by stipa. Stipa steppe is the connection, and we're in sort of a little jumbo, sort of this little fragment of bunchgrass steppe. And then there's annual grassland, which now we have in California since it's been invaded over the last 200 years by annual grasses. Grasslands in North America are very, very diverse. I mean, this 7,500 species is more diverse than all the entire species diversity, plant species diversity in the state of California. So, I mean, that's a lot. Most of the diversity, though, is not, in virtually any grassland, actually, is not due to grasses. even though grasses make up by far most of the biomass, the actual productivity, the carbon being turned into living matter, most of the diversity are small plants and dicot plants that have more showy flowers than grasses. So let me go through this, and I'll give sort of grassland divisions in the United States, or in North America, and I'll give you a little preview of how this breaks down. I'll put that right back up. Here's a map that illustrates at least some of the divisions that I'm going to talk about. We're not even on the map, which isn't fair. We're right in here, and the kind of grassland that Jumbo is a part of, and Sentinel and all this, really isn't even documented on this map, even though it's probably some of the best preserved grassland, native grassland in North America, at least for the proportion of the original area covered. This is a Palouse prairie here, eastern Washington and Oregon, and very, very similar in species composition and ecology to here. Here are these California grasslands, which used to be bunch grasses, similar to the Palouse, but now are annuals. Here's the eastern deciduous forest, and the eastern deciduous forest grades into this tall grass prairie here. Show you a picture in a minute. The tall grass prairie grades to the south and to the west into mixed, that's sort of a tall grass, mixed grass prairie. This is what's called, and these borders, although they're drawn as lines here, are not distinct at all. It's very, very gradual changes. And right here, grading into short grass prairie. Down here, desert grasslands. I'll show you one picture and at least mention them. And then, again, something that's not on here, but that is a very important part of grassland biome in this country, is all the grassland, intermountain grassland is what I've begun to call it, which is what we have on Jumbo and Sentinel, that are spread all through the Rocky Mountains here. In species composition, they're reasonably similar, like I said, similar to the Palouse.
They often call this Palouse area.
Yeah. No, it's fine. It's perfectly fine to call it Palouse. I've sort of switched and tried to get myself to call it Intermountain Prairie because I've been criticized by people that are really grassland experts, which I'm not.
Basically everything around here is like grass. So.
Yeah, it's very similar. And actually, a lot of people consider what we have here in the Intermountain Prairie in these valleys to simply be extensions of the Palouse. But what's interesting, though, is that the Palouse, the real Palouse, is pretty much gone because it was deep soil, relatively level, great for agriculture. So there's not much Palouse left except where the hills are really steep. So we have vast amounts of close to Palouse prairie throughout the Rocky Mountains. So here's a map of sort of what I'm going to touch on briefly, trying to put Jumbo and Sentinel into some perspective here. And I have my slides arranged a little differently, but I think what I'm going to do, since I can't, since the projector has those lights in between, I think what I'm going to do is talk about each grassland type separately and then go back and show slides. So there's 3 divisions, and this outline gets kind of hairy, but it doesn't really matter if you have the outline exactly right. There's 3 main divisions. There's a plains grasslands. And in these plains grasslands, they start as soon as you go out of Lincoln, go over Rogers Pass, drop down on the, off the front there, and you're in the short grass prairie. That's the beginning of the plains grassland. You don't leave it until you get to Indiana and Illinois. It changes gradually, because in Illinois you have this tall grass prairie, like I said, mostly these rhizomatous species that form, a very extensive clonal network of plants, very different than what we have on Jumbo. We'll talk about that a little bit. It's almost certainly the precipitation, though. Yeah, it's hotter and drier as you move towards the Rockies. And here's some genera, or some species, that are common there that we don't have. In other words, that are much less common. Andropogon, Sargastrum, Schizacrium, these are genera that are common and that are dominant, highly productive species in the Illinois, what's left of the Illinois prairies, the tall grass prairies, and not farther to the east. Like I showed you on the map, grades into the eastern deciduous forest, on the east and to the west, it grades into the mixed grass prairie. And you guys are actually going to have to tell me this too. I'm not sure if you're. I'm going a little faster than I would typically go in a class because I don't think you're taking notes. If you want me to slow down at any point, I'm just trying to give you a basic description here. Just yell if I pull this off of here too fast. Because what I want to make sure I have time to do is to talk about the ecology of these grasslands. So mixed grass prairie is kind of nobody knows what to do with them, so it's sort of a grab bag. Okay, it's in between the short grass and the tall grass. Major components, now bunch grasses start to show up a little bit, Muhlenbergia and Aristida, genera that are not common here. Into the north in Canada, it grades into aspen parkland. As you continue to go west, probably again due to this gradient of aridity, you move into short grass prairie. Now where bunch grasses are much more common, dominated is the wrong word, but bunch grasses become a more important component of the community. Calloway and Bootalua are common species, and we do begin to see a lot of these species in eastern Montana. Bootalua is relatively common there.
That's the blue grama?
Blue grama.
That's a bunch grass? So basically all what they call the short grasses are bunch grasses?
No. And no, these are common. Bootalua.
That's the blue grama.
Grasses. I'm not sure if it is or not. Side oats.
Think of that as being the common short grass.
Yes, it's a common short grass. These aren't. I can't remember exactly if these are bunch grasses, but these are dominant genera in the short grass prairie. So grades into the desert, and then in the Rocky Mountains and our intermountain grassland to the west. And desert grasslands are different altogether. I have one picture to show you. Bunch grasses and annuals become a lot more common because of very brief periods of rainfall, kind of unpredictable. So annuals become a more dominant component of the taxa. Hilaria or Zopsis, kind of weird genera that we don't see up here at all. And since the late 1800s, this is really vigorously debated, but since the late 1800s, there appears to have been a lot of shrub invasion. In other words, big changes. Nobody really knows why. Whether there's a guy named Steve Archer at Texas A&M that studied this for a long time. Nobody really knows why, but some people have attributed to a large degree of grazing, making it possible for trees like mesquite and sometimes creosote bush, Lariat, to get established, and others to changes in short-term changes or long-term changes in climate.
Why not humans?
Pardon?
Why not humans?
Well, cattle would be part of the human process, yeah. And people argue that, yeah, I mean, it could be. Another thing that I haven't heard argued as much, but it's really important here, is fire, and I'm not sure, but it could be that fire has been suppressed there since European colonization and has changed a lot of things. Contributed to the change of grassland to a savanna. So let me back up just a little bit. These are sort of the plains grasslands now, that one big broad type. And I tried to be very careful to keep my outline sort of numbered and lettered right here. Yeah. Another type, as completely opposed to that prairie grass or the plains grassland, is the California annual grassland. And remember I said that this is not really fair, because now it's annual grassland because the European grasses used to be Stipa, Elymus, Melica, and Stipa. The genus there, has now been changed, and I can't remember. Does anybody know the new name of Stipa? It's some long, weird-sounding genus now. Nobody does. Well, it's no longer Stipa officially in the new Jepson manual, but now Bromus and Avena are by far the dominant species. If you look at it, if you walk in it, it looks natural, it looks normal. I mean, they're completely naturalized grasses over the last couple of hundred years, but they were brought by Europeans. And then finally, and this is the closest to us, both in taxonomy and in morphology, and that's the Palouse prairie, like Jock mentioned, and even some people call this prairie here sort of an extension, a far eastern extension of the Palouse. and genera here that are relatively common. Pseudoregenaria is the new name for agropyron. So instead of agropyron spicatum, it's a Pseudoregenaria spicata. But everybody still calls it ag spic, and you'll see a lot of that when you go up on the hill with peat. Festuca is very common, and I'll talk about Festuca a lot because we've done a lot of experiments on the ecology of Festuca and how it interacts with knapweed, the major invader up there, and Elamis and Stipa, not nearly as common as the first. So, I guess maybe let me keep that covered up and see if I can ask you guys. This is, I mean, I don't know the answer to the questions that I'm going to throw out here, but it's still important to think about. Grassland, as you can see, occurs in a lot of different climate types. And so ecologists, probably since the late 1800s when they began to get interested in biogeography, have been trying to figure out, why grasslands? Why, what particular climatic regime or whatever physical regime might contribute to, sort of this global pattern of grasslands. So what do you think? You guys think for a second. What do you think might be sort of a determining factor for grasslands? And I'll present at least a few of the sort of the. So what about the climate?
The arid or it's moist.
So.
The severity of the climate, like the winters. And then
Okay. So maybe more continental. Okay, so a continental climate would sort of promote grassland sort of development. That's exactly what a big argument for that.
I don't know continental, because if you look at North America, and like you showed in the slides and stuff, you have all these different regions.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to zero it down a lot closer of an area, smaller of an area than just continental. So I do think climate, geology.
Okay, so
The mineral source in the soil.
Okay.
Other things will survive.
Okay, so we have a few options here. One is continentality. In other words, let me take 2 seconds to. Continentality is an attribute of climate that is related to the distance from water. Water warms and cools very slowly, so it buffers. So you get far away. You all know this just by living in Missoula. You move far. You're in Seattle. It stays the same all the time. You go to Rapid City. It's freezing and boiling, and it's, changes dramatically with the climate. But that's due to continentality. So one argument has been, and it's on the list here somewhere. One argument has been is you get really continental places with these extreme winters and extreme summers. That's no good for woody plants, and so you develop prairie or grasslands. Okay, it doesn't fit California or California grasslands, or a lot of global, doesn't fit tropical grasslands, doesn't fit Palouse grasslands. What else do you think might be important if you had to kind of the development or formation of grasslands? What do you think? What particular aspect about soils? This is another. I'm not sure.
I mean, I just know here that if I walk across my family's property, how much clay versus how much sand versus
Great.
how much organic material.
So which would you think would be more typically correlated with grasslands or grass sort of morphology?
Less more mineral, less organic.
Okay. What about?
Palouse is loamy. I mean,
Okay. Well. Okay. It's not going to answer all of them. Okay. Let's back up just a little bit. When you're talking about pardon?
Porosity in soils, like it holds water.
Very, very close. And at least this is one argument, and I think it probably is important for California, real important for California. You mentioned clay. What is clay?
Small particles.
Small, right, fine particles. It's not silt because it's too fine for silt. Clay, I don't remember the numbers. I'll make them up. You guys, clay is less, I'll be very close. Clay is less than 0.002, I think, millimeters. Does that sound right? Oh. Okay, in diameter. Silt would be 0.002 to 0.2. Am I right?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Okay, clay is very fine. Okay, silt is in between. Sand goes up to kind of big, and then it goes to gravel. So where do you think you find grasses typically? I mean, typically. In general, it's not always the case. Again, California grasslands are probably a good example of this. Think you'd find them on really coarse sandy soils more often, or clay soils? Yeah, why? Yeah, clay. In other words, think about it. It rains on clay. I live in East Missoula on Brickyard Hill, and the water penetrates about that far, and that's it. I don't know for sure, but it seems like about that far. And a woody plant that has roots that go down 10 feet is not going to see a lot of the water that falls, especially water that falls in the summer. And that'll come up in a second. So in other words, some people have hypothesized, theorized, you get grasslands in some places where water's held near the surface, at least during the growing season. Real important because grass is dormant. During the growing season, when in fine clay soils, where they can suck it back up, and especially these annuals in California, and then just die when it's all gone. And it's not such a good place for perennials to grow. Okay, woody things to grow.
This slope must play in that too somewhere, doesn't it?
It does up here. I don't know on a broad scale. Certainly on a small scale, and I don't know. Here it's very clear. Pardon me?
If it was flatter, it would soak in the clay more.
Yeah, I don't know. Sure, it certainly makes sense. In other words, if it's flat in clay, then we might get a little bit deeper. If it's steep in clay, then it's going to go very fast, or run off very fast and not penetrate very deep. Yeah, again, that would be sort of a local thing, I think, instead of large-scale global stuff. I don't know, though, to tell you the truth. So, what do I have here? It is complex, but this was mentioned. Somebody mentioned this first. Basically, it's too dry for forest, too wet for desert, but it's very difficult to separate out fire and soil. So we didn't bring up fire, but I will in a second. One group of people have argued, and by the way, that reminds me, I should have mentioned this at the very beginning. If you're interested in sort of kind of global or North American biomes, in other words, characteristics of deserts, grasslands, forests, and so on, and sort of a summary of research that's been done on them, there's a pretty good book that's been edited by Barber and Billings, Mike Barber and Dwight Billings, and I think you can get it in our bookstore. And it's just called North American Vegetation, Terrestrial Vegetation North America. Yeah, it's a green book, and it's just sort of divided up by North American biomes. And it's a good place, sort of a resource for this kind of information. So, pronounced summer rain, and that makes sense. You're going to have a grass that grows in the summertime. It's not doing anything in the wintertime. So pronounced summer rain, so it's wet when it can be active. Okay, maybe that favors grasses, and it makes sense in the plains grasslands where there tends to be pronounced summer rain, but it doesn't make sense for California or the Palouse for that matter. In other words, we know here we don't have pronounced summer rain. We have pronounced spring and fall rain. We have spring and fall green up. So, and we still have grasslands. So it doesn't answer all of the questions. One thing that nobody brought up and that I sort of didn't let the discussion go long enough because I didn't think of it, but fire is probably very, very important, and probably was very important here as well. I mean, especially look at the east side of Jumbo, where you can see, I mean, thousands and thousands of small Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. Sort of kind of gives the impression of sort of expanding away from relatively large, older adult trees. In other words, probably the fire suppression on Jumbo and Sentinel has led to the expansion of a lot of woody plants. And with repeated and probably low-level fires, the grassland on Mount Jumbo is either maintained or at least expanded to some degree. And for tallgrass prairie as well, there's little tiny remnants. There's virtually no tallgrass prairie left because tallgrass prairie, like in Illinois, grows on soils, glacial loess that's deeper than this room. So it's great for growing another grass, corn, and other things like soybeans and whatnot. And so there's very little left, and the little patches that do remain, like the University of Illinois has preserved, they have to burn them. If they don't burn them, they become forest relatively quickly. So fire in that system is probably very important to actually maintaining this grassland. So it's not just soil, not just climate, but probably a disturbance regime is important as well. And probably this disturbance regime is important on Jumbo.
Recently saw a postcard that was taken in like 1900, and it shows Jumbo from the west side, and there's just like little woody vegetation in the draws, and the rest is all completely grassland. It's all that forest that's coming down the saddle from the west side.
There's nothing there.
Nothing there. It's all grassland.
I'd love to see that postcard from the east side because I mean there's really a lot of very small trees, and up right at the saddle. I mean I go up there and hike and walk quite a bit. There's an awful lot of very small, very thick Doug fir and ponderosa pine. Yeah, the whole Doug fir ponderosa pine story is a whole another fire story.
All you gotta do is go to the Burger King, where I just got my supper right here at downtown, off of Broadway. And as you walk in, there's a circa 1890s
Oh, really?
fire of the rattlesnake, where it has maybe 10 houses, and it's all flat. There's no trees.
Yeah.
This is just, you know.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll make my.
Well, I understand that the Indians burned Jumbo practically every year, and also, am I correct that they also burned the prairies all across the middle part of the country? And
This is. I've heard the same. I've heard the same thing, but it's not something I know. I've Lewis and Clark, or maybe it was somebody that came soon after Lewis and Clark. I've read this little, copies from the journal where he had a guide, a Native American guide, who was taking him up somewhere in this vicinity, and he said that periodically, he'd light some dry lichens and throw it, and once, from what I understand, once in this area horses became part of the currency, then there was a lot of burning, not just for game, but just to maintain pasture for horses. And to my knowledge, it was the same thing. Native Americans burned a lot, sort of in the plains prairies as well. But I don't think it.
by the fire. I mean, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of years that might have been going on, but.
Right. I think there would be plenty of fire anyway. Lightning strike fire there and here would still be very, very common. Yeah. What I was going to mention, just a little bit to the side about fire, the ecologist that I replaced in this job, his name is Jim Habeck. He's done some really nice work, including up in Paddy Canyon, in trying to reconstruct pre-European settlement forests. And probably not only were grasslands more expanded around here on Jumbo and everywhere else, where you did find forests, it was probably very, very different, and probably consisted of large ponderosa pines in almost a savanna-like state until you got up pretty high in elevation. So big ponderosas and open, a lot of bunch grass steppe in between them. Quite different nowadays. What we see is where the big ponderosas are left, a lot of Douglas fir coming in underneath them. We're really creating more of a forest rather than a savanna. Jim Habeck? He writes comments and letters to the Missoulian periodically. He's around a lot. I mean, he's he's definitely an expert on sort of forests in this region. Another guy who is very active in this right now out at the Fire Lab is Steve Arno. Again, really excellent scientist. So anyway, fire, favoring perennial herbs over woody species. Perennial herbs, yeah, they don't. We'll talk about this a little bit more later. You can take everything off of the top. These grasses don't have their growing meristems or their growing tissue. We grow sort of all over. Okay, cells divide like crazy. Plants are very, very particular about where they divide, and they only divide in places called meristems. Well, trees and shrubs and even other dicots, or plants that have showy flowers, have their meristems out in the tips, so they kind of grow out from the tip. Well, I'll show this on the overhead in a little while when we talk about herbivory, but grasses grow from the base, and meristems are called intercalary meristems, and so that growing tissue is down low, so a relatively cool fire could pass over it. Yeah, they just resprout, big deal. It just gets rid of dead stuff that shades them. So they're well adapted to fire. High in silica, and this is getting a little bit far-fetched now. Some people have argued that grasses are actually adapted to kind of carry a fire a little bit. Maybe, in other words, and so they've said, there's lots of silica in these stems, more than you find in other plants. So those nice, dry, flammable stems float around out there until a fire comes along and wham, and goes like crazy and burns up all those nasty trees and bushes, and it's just grassland. So some people have argued for sort of an adaptationist perspective on this. High flammability, seed survival is high for most grasses in fires, and like I said, parts are below ground. Now this is kind of an interesting thing here. There may be sort of a climate connection with this fire story. Remember where I mentioned that some people have argued, at least for the plains grasslands, again, different than what we have here, that, summer rains, big deal. You got to have summer rain so that water comes when these grasses are growing, like your lawn. You can't have winter rain. That percolates down deep, and then you get shrubs like Great Basin sage and whatnot. Maybe so. But it's interesting that summer rain is correlated with lightning, right? So it may not be the summer rain. It may be these storms, that get fires started. At least some people have argued for that. 73%. This is from a study I picked up. Northern Great Plains, 73% of all lightning-caused fires occurred in July and August with those summer rains. So, fire's probably a big deal. Other people have argued, and we're going to come back to herbivory sort of from a different angle, but other people have argued that herbivory is important. For example, there are those that argue that the reason you have bunch grasses here and these rhizomatous turf grasses in the Great Plains is because of thousands of years of grazing by large mammal herbivores. And again, I'm not sure. I think the climatic difference is probably more important. But turf grasses are very resistant to things like bison, stomping on them, and chewing them up and eating them down to the ground and then leaving. And this turf grass, this large clonal thing covering, many acres, sprouts right back up. Bunch grasses typically are sensitive to heavy grazing. Their meristems are kind of around the edge, and if you graze it back too hard, it's really tough on a bunch grass. Okay. And so some people have argued that the patterns you see out there, again related to this where the meristems are, may be somewhat connected to herbivory, and herbivory may play a big role in keeping some kinds of plants out of what we call grasslands. And again, I doubt that that's a major component of kind of the grassland forest boundary here. So grasses now can do a lot of things that sort of connect them with this idea, this important idea of a drought period. I mean, you brought up the idea that grasslands may be related to continentality, and also maybe a period of drought, at least some period of drought that doesn't favor woody perennials, and it gives grasses an opportunity. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about weird things or unusual things that grasses, at least some grasses, do that may permit them or may give them a slight advantage in areas where there is at least some drought. First of all, grasses are basically most, if not all, monocots. Plants are divided up into two large groups. Monocots, which would include grasses and lilies and sedges, okay, and their flowers, other than lilies, are often very small, like grass flowers. And then dicots, or dicotyledons. They're different in the seedling stage. And grasses have unique stomata, and stomata is the place where gas is exchanged. In other words, that's the action site for virtually all life getting started on this planet. Now, through the stomata, CO2 comes from the air, what we breathe out, and moves through that little tiny hole, okay, and inside that plant is converted to organic matter, living tissue, okay. So most stomata. Well, before I get on to this a little bit, what's the cost? Okay, so in other words, you got to get CO2. You have to get carbon. You're right. So in other words, you got to trade, and that's basically, I mean, plants. That's what plants need water for. Is basically to trade. They don't use it very much. A little bit like we do. Plants don't use water to cool off. A little bit, but not much. Use water a little bit, maybe to pull in some kinds of nutrients. But for the most part, what they do is they use that water. They trade it like money for CO2. Okay, and if they can get that CO2 cheap, it's good. And you don't want to give a lot of water if you live in a dry place. You want to give just a little water. You get a lot of CO2 for a little water. You want to be a good, sort of have a good budget. So grasses have unique stomata, these little holes where the gas goes in and out. And let me show you how these grasses compare. To most other plants. Over here on the left is the typical stomata here. It's like these two little balloons. Okay, here's an open stomata. Gas is moving through this hole right here. And here's a closed stomata. What happens is when the plant has to have CO2, has to breathe, potassium is pumped into a cell. It just makes it very salty. And since it's salty, water goes in there. And those cells swell up and get all turgid with water. And it pops this little hole open. Okay, and then CO2 can move in. Okay, and here, when it's deciding, oh, it's too expensive to be losing water right now for CO2, or it gets dark, so you don't want to leave your stomata open at night unless you're a cactus, then potassium is pumped back out, so the salinity is dropped in those cells, water leaves, okay, and then they just kind of relax and kind of slump together as they're relaxed. So this is a pretty good system. A lot of plants do very well with these kinds of stomata. But grasses have stomata that look like this, and it's a very, very important adaptation to dealing with drought. They look like these little dumbbells, like workout things, and they work in very much the same way: potassium in, water in, potassium out, water out. But they're very, very sensitive. In other words, little tiny changes can regulate this hole because of the shapes of these cells right here. And so the plant can kind of fine-tune, or a grass can fine-tune very nicely. So it's a little dry. Ooh, I don't want to lose too much water, but I want a little bit. I can kind of grade down just a little bit. And other plants can't do that very well. They try to, they don't have a fine-tuned knob on their stomata. So they just open, shut. And grasses can tune very carefully. So what they can do is be very, very efficient for the water that they lose, for the CO2 that they take out. So grasses have weird stomata, and that may contribute to their ability to occupy. This is a real life surface. It's not a very good picture, but I couldn't find the slide. Over here on the left again, this is a dicot, a potato. Sort of this jigsaw puzzle, and you see those little fat lip stomata. And over here is corn, okay, and it's hard to see, but these little fine-tuned stomata, the cells that do the regulation, there's a good one right here. Those are the cells right there, very small dumbbell-shaped cells, very sensitive, sort of fine-tuned knob. Another thing that grasses do a lot, although it's not as common in the grasses that you find here in the Palouse or Intermountain grassland, is that they change the shape of their leaves, and they can do it in a day, or they can do it in a few hours. In other words, they get a little bit dry, they can kind of roll up, or then they can expand back out again. And let me show you a picture, and then I'll show you a slide that illustrates. Oh, and I forgot to go back to my slides. I'll show you a bunch of slides. Here's an example of what two species of grasses that are from the plains type of grassland do in response to drought. Here's Andropogon gerardii and Spartina pectinata. This is what's going on when the water potential is high, or when very little stress. Lots of water, they're cruising along, they open up. Lots of light, lots of sun, they can go like crazy. They got plenty of water. But when they start running out, Okay, when water gets low, in other words, now they're in trouble, they fold up. Okay, they just fold like this, and I'll show you a cross-section of the stem in just a second. Okay, and over here Spartina. Here it is when the water when it's not very water stressed, and there's plenty of water, it's flat and open. Okay, you dry that soil out a little bit, it does something like this. It either like curls inside of itself like this, or it curls up like so. Okay, and reduces the surface area a lot. And this does a couple of things for the plant when there's very little, for grass in particular, when it's very dry. One, as you'll see in the slide, the stomata are folded up inside the holes where the water go in and out. Okay, so it gets sort of a humid tube. And the other is not very much light can hit that surface now. It's not spread out getting really hot. It's folded up, so very little light is actually incident on the plant. So this weird kind of folding behavior. See what? Yeah, thanks. I forgot to show these slides, but I'll mention them since I got to go through anyway. This is a tallgrass prairie in Illinois, a very small ruminant patch. That's a 5'5" woman and a 1-year-old child in here, and you can see why they call it tallgrass. I mean, we're talking 6-7 feet high for the grasses and for a lot of the dicots as well. But you're gonna have to push twice because I left spaces. I thought they would be dark. Good example of shortgrass prairie in Nebraska, and most of the grasses are in the back, but it gives you an idea of how diverse and how important dicots, very showy flowering plants can be too. This is not quite desert, but desert grassland with bunch grasses, a lot of Orzopsis in the foreground, and mostly mesquite in the background. And this is real desert grassland. Now, this is creosote bush, probably relatively recently invaded, mixed in with, again, Orzopsis and, I forgot, darn it. Southern New Mexico. Good example of California grassland. Right on the coast here, there's also grassland in the interior, but it's very similar. And again, many people think that a lot of this grassland this grassland is proportionally more common on very clay substrates. Oh, sorry, there's a few California. I wanted to sort of illustrate the change. This is California grassland in February or January or maybe early March. Real green, going like crazy. Everybody's alive, producing seed. And there's oak woodland, but this is what it looks like in August. Everybody's dead and the trees are taken over. So here's this folding business that I was talking about, and it doesn't just happen by accident. It's actually controlled by specialized cells. No, they just push it, and just slide the thing over just a little. Yeah. Specialized cells here, this is andropogon, sort of in the hinges of the leaf. And here's the stomata here, the holes, and what happens is water's pumped out of these cells so the grass contracts really fast. Okay, and when the water conditions, either the humidity in the air or the water in the soil is more favorable, water's pumped into these buliform cells, and they expand, it flattens the grass out again so it can photosynthesize at a high rate. So this sort of folding procedure is relatively common in grasses, and I think I've got these out of order. This is Palouse prairie. This is the slide that I was going to use. Oh, back up. This is Eastern Oregon, and again, it's a little too light in here. But this is classic Palouse prairie here. This is close to the Blue Mountains in Oregon. Go ahead. I don't know what I've done. That's close. Back up, and we'll get to that. Maybe that's what's next on my outline. Not quite. We're almost there. Before I quit talking completely about, let's see, stop here and pretty soon. Sort of gas going in and out of leaves, I want to mention another sort of oddball thing that a lot of grasses do. How many of you guys have heard of C3 versus C4 photosynthesis? Does this ring a bell with anybody? Okay, a few. It's really pretty straightforward, but a lot of grasses do sort of a strange thing with the chemicals inside their leaves. So let me ask you something. Just think about it for a second. How does the stomata opens? Okay, now there's a hole. How does CO2 go into that leaf? Why does it go into the leaf? Keep going.
If it's used up, CO2 inside, that lowers the...
There you go. Okay, so basically what happens is it's getting used up inside, so there's very little of the CO2, this all-important molecule for making life, inside, so it creates a gradient, and CO2 just moves through that hole. Used up, moves through, because there's very little inside, there's a lot outside, creates a gradient. Well, what creates a gradient? It's used up. Does anybody have any idea what causes that gradient? You know, it's a fundamental aspect of this, let me get out of the way, of the C3, the typical photosynthesis process. Almost everybody out here, except for in this part of the country, everybody out here is doing normal C3 photosynthesis. Pardon me? So, but something's got to happen inside that leaf to create this gradient. What happens to where does the CO2 go? Pardon? Okay, it goes into sugars, into carbohydrates, so it's no longer CO2. And to get that started, there's an enzyme, most common protein in the world. The nickname of it is Rubisco. Big deal. Rubisco, Rubisco. And what it does is, as the molecule of CO2 comes in, it grabs it and takes it off and shunts it into this pathway and takes it and makes sugars out of it, or carbohydrate. So each one comes in, it grabs it, takes it off, and goes and makes sugars. So the faster it takes that CO2 away, okay, the steeper the gradient, right? If it's really good at it, then there's a really steep gradient. If it's not so good, well, then there's CO2 floating around in the leaf. So CO2 doesn't come in very fast. So if CO2 doesn't come in very fast, what's the problem? You lose a lot of water. You got the hole open, and CO2 is coming in very slowly. So and Rubisco actually is not that good at it. It's strange, but it's not. But a lot of grasses, and especially as you go south, a lot of grasses use a different enzyme. They use something called PEP carboxylase. And PEP carboxylase is really good at grabbing the CO2, okay, and getting rid of it immediately, very, very fast. So it creates a very steep gradient. So grasses that do this C4 business get a whole lot of CO2 and lose very little water. So they're very efficient. It's a good budget, okay, just because they have a different chemical inside, a different enzyme inside to grab that CO2. So a lot of grasses are there are other plants besides grasses that are C4, but in grasses C4 is very, very common.
Is that the only difference between C3 or C4? Isn't there a spatial?
Oh yeah, there's morphological differences as well. And there are very important temperature differences, but more difficult to explain in a short period of time. So the way grasses get their CO2 for the water is a little different in a number of ways than a lot of other plants. And also the way grasses take up water is a little bit different. I don't want to make a big deal out of this, but grasses' root systems are really quite different. And I've been looking at root systems of grasses and knapweeds now for all week long, just taking them out of these pots. I've seen 1,000 of them. But usually dicots, or plants that put on big showy flowers, have a taproot that comes right out of the seed and goes down and then puts off little fine roots off of the taproot, okay? Grasses typically, well, they never grow a taproot. Matter of fact, the root that first comes out of the seed of a grass dies immediately. And new roots are produced actually from the base of the stem. And those roots are weird. Those roots are very fibrous and they're tough. And they grow in a very, very dense pattern, generally at the surface. And that's what this next slide was to illustrate. Grasses typically produce very, very dense rooting networks. This is from an annual grass. I mean, one that simply does all of that, makes all of those roots in the course of about 2 or 3 months. Way, way more roots than above ground shoot tissue. Again, unlike most other plants. So it produces a whole lot of roots, but in some cases these roots can go amazingly deep in the soil. This is a picture in the 1930s of a famous ecologist named Weaver, who spent a large part of his career digging deep holes and getting in them and then clearing away soil and drawing pictures of grass roots. And this is in the tall grass prairie, and he's still drawing roots down here. I mean, the roots go down a long, long ways. Hit one more slide. This is a photograph from one of his old books, and these are in feet, but here's roots still going down. It's out of focus. 5, 6, 7, 8 feet. 8 feet into the ground, you're still finding grass roots down here. It's very, very different than up on Sentinel and Jumbo. I've measured with root periscope tubes root growth seasonally, and very little is going on below, maybe 50 centimeters or so. So although our soils are much shallower. So the nature of the root system for grasses, either here or in the tall grass prairie, is very different. And grasses also do a really bizarre thing, and with this I'll stop and we'll take a break. They develop very complex mutualisms. In other words, mutually beneficial relationships with fungi in the soil. Almost all plants up here on Jumbo and Sentinel have in their roots fungi, and this is not just restricted to grasses, but I'll talk about this in a lot of detail when I get to interactions. But about 80% of the plants in the world have fungi attached to their roots, and they trade with that fungus. They give the fungus carbon that they are fixed carbon, or photosynthesized carbon, that they bring in through their leaves, okay, and then they feed that fungus. The fungus acts like a giant root system and grows all throughout the soil and brings in primarily phosphorus, a very, very difficult nutrient for plants to get. Okay, and the fungus even has the appropriate enzyme to make the phosphorus available to the plant. So these fungi, this fungus-plant relationship is very, very important, and we're just beginning to understand how this mutualism called a mycorrhizae works and how it regulates how plants interact, either with native species or with invasive species. There are a couple of different types. Let's see here. This is a picture, this is not a grass, this is a picture of a ponderosa pine root that has been grown in a pot only with organic phosphorus. So it really, in other words, it's not available, the plant can't take up organic phosphorus, only the fungus can. So it's covered with this fungus. Here's the root, and everything is just covered with just a mat of this fungus, because it desperately needs this fungus to pull in nutrients. And it's providing that fungus with food, with energy. There's two different there's more than this, but these are the two different types. This is the type that tree has. They're called ectomycorrhizae. It's just this mat of fungus that grows around the root. Grasses and a few other plants, including knapweed up here, has a very, very intimate relationship with fungi that grow in its roots. And there are different kinds. They're called, VAM or now AM, because of the arbuscular mycorrhizae. They grow these special little sites inside the cell. In other words, this fungus is just kind of all growing in between the cells, but this fungus has a very intimate relationship, and it actually has a morphological structure that penetrates into the cell, that's the arbuscule, and grows out, and at that site exchanges energy for nutrients, okay, with the fungus. Plant exchanges with the fungus. And these types of fungi, we're beginning to find out, are very, very important to what's going on up here up on Sentinel and on Jumbo. So, one more time, I think I have one more slide to point. I wanted to point out one more thing about this relationship. This is a ponderosa pine root, and this is a ponderosa pine root. And what this, from two different plants, what this illustrates is that the relationship between the fungus and the plant, and it's the same thing up here, is it depends. It's very delicate. This ponderosa pine was provided with all the phosphorus it wanted in available form that it could take up itself. And look at it, it's gotten rid of all the fungus. Here the fungus is a little bit of a parasite. Okay, so the relationship changes. You give the plant phosphorus, and it doesn't want to give carbon to that fungus anymore. It wants to get rid of it so it can use all the carbon itself. Here, the plant doesn't have available phosphorus, and so it needs that symbiotic or mutualistic relationship with the fungus. And this variation, too, is very, very important to how these communities up here on Jumbo and Sentinel work, how the plants interact with one another, and apparently now it's very, very important to how at least knapweed is invading these communities. And let's stop, and that's what I'm going to change gears completely and start talking about knapweed and research that has been going on in my lab with knapweed invasion up here. I've been doing some work that I want to finish with here, this coevolution in plant communities idea at the end. I'm doing it right now, trying to finish this blasted experiment. I thought I was going to finish on last Friday. I'm going to finish tomorrow if I'm lucky. But we've been focusing on knapweed, and there, as you guys know, and as you will see when you go up with Pete Lessica on Saturday, he's an excellent field botanist. He knows everything on the mountain. And what you're going to see is that an awful lot of the plants up there in this relatively good condition, Intermountain Prairie, are not from here at all, but they're from Europe and from Asia. And they're doing very well here. And it's weird. This is a weird thing. And this is, in my opinion, one of the more interesting things in ecology. This is a strange thing. Centaurea maculosa is a great example. Knapweed. Here, it's a nightmare. Here, it creates monocultures that are many, many, many acres. All you see in September and October is sort of this purple flowered, majesty across the whole thing there, and nothing else. And in many places, you can dig around underneath, and that's it. It's knapweed. Maybe you can get some other introduced grass, Bromus tectorum underneath, maybe, but often it creates virtual monocultures. If you go to Eurasia, actually when I showed you that slide, I said it was from eastern Georgia, the Caucasus Mountains, find Centaurea there, but you have to really look for it. You don't find very much of it there. It's not common, and it doesn't grow in large patches, very small isolated patches. Nobody knows why this is. In other words, nobody knows why so many plants, if you just take them from their native habitat and move them to another habitat, they do so well. We'll come up with a few different ideas. One idea that most ecologists would throw forth immediately is that they've gotten away from what eats them. Okay, that knapweed and over there in Asia, and it's got all its insect and everything else predators that eat it, and they keep it under control. And if you took those away, well, I'd go crazy in Asia too. And so what we do here is bring a lot of those predators from Asia here. And we've released, I think, about a dozen insects from Asia to try to control knapweed, none of which are working very, very well. I'm going to talk about a number of these different issues right now. So, how many of you guys, how many of you in here have heard of the word allelopathy? So a few of you. This is I don't know exactly why, but this really gets a lot of plant ecologists and really upset. You've got more than any other issue, I think, at least in plant ecology, you've got people that allelopathy runs the world, and other people doesn't exist. It's a figment. And what allelopathy is is the idea that plants can emit chemicals, and plants are just chemical factories. I mean, different species have so many different kinds of chemicals, but plants emit chemicals that do bad things to their neighbors. And instead of just their roots kind of growing together and having it out, for a molecule of nitrogen or phosphorus, they, spit stuff at each other and they poison one another, okay? And so that, they create some space that's it's all mine, I poison everybody else and take what's there. So there's these two schools of thought. One school of thought, kind of the mathematically oriented group, maybe, I don't know, tends to like sort of being able to model competition for resources, water, phosphorus, nitrogen, light, that's it. Heck with all these poisons, it's ridiculous. Other people say, no, there's a lot of chemicals that are released from plants that have effects on other plants. Knapweed has been sort of, when I got here, I read about knapweed. Some people suspicioned that knapweed might have chemicals that damage plants around it, okay? And so one of my first graduate student, I got her involved in a project that was similar to one that I worked on with desert plants, creosote bush and some other plants in the desert, looking at how roots kind of interacted with one another, how roots got close to one another. And the design was, let me see, I'm going to draw this up here if I can. We built these boxes, one box like this, okay, and in here we put a knapweed, okay, and these boxes, the backside is clear, okay, so you can look right through it, okay, and we covered it up with a shutter, but the backside is clear, it's clear plexiglass, so we could look at the roots. Made another box like this, okay, that's a hole, that's an empty hole, again, this is all black plastic, or plexiglass, the backside it's clear. And here we put Festuca idahoensis, one of the native bunch grasses here. Grew them for a little while and then took these two and put them together so that the Festuca roots were growing down into the knapweed roots. So when the whole thing was attached, it looked like this. And let's pretend we're looking at it from the back side, okay? So these Festuca roots are growing down along the plexiglass so we can measure them right at these knapweed roots. Knapweed roots look more like that. Okay? And we could measure what happened when these roots came close. And then now that we grew these Festuca roots at the knapweed in two different treatments. One, just sand, okay, relatively fine grit sand. And in the other, we added activated carbon, just like you'd put in your fish tank, to the sand. And activated carbon it could do other things. So it's not the perfect experiment, but it's not bad. The activated carbon coats, a little tiny bit, coats all these sand particles, at least many of them, with, and it's very, very adsorbent to organic molecules. In other words, you just run all that nasty stuff from your fish tank through a filter with activated carbon, it traps it, keeps it, okay? It doesn't do its dirty deed in the fish tank. So we've got these roots from Festuca growing at knapweed, with and without the activated carbon. So what we wondered was, hey, if we put some activated carbon in there, maybe we'll reduce any effect, if there is one, that knapweed roots have on Festuca roots. And so we were curious, do Festuca roots exude something, or seem to exude something, that's bad on the roots of a native plant? So, these are just some of the results here, but it illustrates it really pretty nicely. So these are the elongation rates of the roots. Now I'll walk through this slowly, just stop me if I'm not making any sense. Over here on this axis, root elongation rate. So here they're not moving at all, here they're going really fast. And this is time on this axis, and we've just calibrated this. Here's where the Festuca roots make contact, okay, with the knapweed roots. So over here, they haven't touched them yet. Over here, they've touched them. Now, this bar here, now remember, here they are, it starts off slow, faster, 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 and then they both kind of declined late in the experiment. But this is the rate that the roots grew, the Festuca roots, the native bunchgrass roots. This is the rate that those roots grew at when there was no carbon in the soil. And they pretty much, we're getting very close to stopping early on. Okay, when there's a little bit of carbon in the soil, about 1 to 100 in proportion, boy, these roots, they grew much faster, at least in the middle part of the experiment. And even here, there's a large significant difference. And this suggests, again, direct effects of this carbon could create problems for us. But it's strong evidence that knapweed roots exude something that's nasty, or that the fescue roots don't like. And if you kind of make that whole thing a little more simple, look at it like this, the differences look a little bit more dramatic. This is the root elongation, the total root elongation over the experiment. These are roots that never quite touch knapweed roots, and these are the roots that ran into the knapweed roots, but it doesn't matter. There's carbon in the soil. This C is for carbon. There's carbon in the soil. The roots of whatever type grew much longer than roots where there was no carbon. Again, it's not, there are some problems, but it's reasonable evidence that knapweed roots exude something that slow the growth rate of festuca roots. So we took that a little bit farther and planted, looks complicated, but it's not once I explain it a little bit. We planted knapweed with festuca in pots, just grew them in little competition experiments. And we either just had sand, okay, or we had sand plus 1 to 100 carbon. Okay, the activated carbon, this stuff that we think can adhere to these bad organic molecules. Okay, and then compared the total biomass of the plants at the end of the experiment. So this is a fescue or festuca mass, how big it got. Okay, here's a root and a shoot and a total. So you can look at any one of these. It doesn't matter. It's all the same. Let's just look at the total here. This is how big they got when they grew with other festucas. Fescue, carbon, it didn't matter. Okay, at least not significantly. So when they grew with other festucas, they were very happy. When they grew with knapweed, without carbon, okay, nothing to sort of ameliorate that whatever's coming off of those roots, they were less than half the size. But when you added carbon, they went back up to about the same. Okay, again, suggesting that sort of on a larger scale that putting something in that soil to change what knapweed's doing to the native plant helps the native plant out. In other words, again, evidence for sort of root exudations. And sort of contrasting with that, or the counterpart of that, is this. Knapweed did significantly, a little bit worse when carbon was added to the soil. It seemed to lose a little bit of its competitive advantage. Okay, so here's knapweed mass now over here. And when there's carbon in the soil, the knapweed's smaller. Festuca's bigger, knapweed's smaller. Okay, festuca appears to have a competitive advantage when you add this carbon to the soil. Okay, and we're finishing other experiments with a lot more plants and Centaurea diffusa, a different knapweed, right now. So again, I mean, this is evidence that knapweed does have some allelopathic potential. What we don't know, and this is very, very important, is relatively how important this is. Okay, we have other evidence that knapweed is really, really good at taking up phosphorus fast out of the soil. We found this out by accident. We were trying to do experiments with radioactive phosphorus, and we did a little experiment where we just did one plant, put a fescue and a knapweed together, put a little isotope in the soil, and Friday night, and I came back Saturday morning, just kind of wandering around, and looked in the hot room and thought, man, that knapweed looks bad. I wonder what the deal is. I mean, this was like 12 to 15 hours later. So I went in, and the knapweed fried, it was dead. And so what we think happened is that, it was greedy, it just took all the phosphorus right away, and that phosphorus happened to be radioactive, and it killed it. So in other words, it suggests that knapweed, is a better competitor for resources, as well as releasing nasty things out of its roots. And we don't really know which is more important. I mean, this may be relatively small in comparison, but it does appear to have a role. So,
that we'd be going to have a little phosphorus in it.
yeah, but I think the phosphorus is probably part of the active ingredient. I don't think it, I don't know, but it would be my guess. Phosphorus is probably part of the molecule that does the damage to the weed. Yeah, rather than being sort of in there as a nutrient. So, knapweed roots seem to be allelopathic or release exudates. And another graduate student, her name was Marilyn Marler. The first one's name was Wendy Ridenauer. Marilyn Marler was looking for a project, and she got interested in looking at mycorrhizae. I just mentioned mycorrhizae, these fungi that are so important to many plants. And we thought, well, I bet you that knapweed, since it releases all this nasty stuff, I bet knapweed releases nasty stuff, and that does bad things to the fungus. So we decided, hey, let's go out and do a survey, and let's measure the plants that are next to knapweed. And I bet they don't have many mycorrhizae, and I bet knapweed's not mycorrhizal either. We asked a few people around, including Pete Lessica, and the consensus was that knapweed's not mycorrhizal. So we collected knapweed off of sentinel and other plants of festuca and agropyron off of sentinel, and same down in the bitterroot. Knapweed is loaded with mycorrhizae. This is weird, loaded with mycorrhizae, and it didn't have any effect on any measurable, strong effect on the mycorrhizae of the native plants. So this weird chemical, whatever it might be, the roots are not affecting this fungal relationship at all. So then we decided to try some experiments, and this is weird stuff, and it may be a very important thing that knapweed does. We decided to do some experiments to see how mycorrhizae regulated the interaction. Okay, we know knapweed comes in and just thumps native plants, at least many of the native grasses. But we wondered, does mycorrhizae play a part in this? So we did some experiments in which we grew knapweed by itself, just to see what mycorrhizae did. It's loaded with mycorrhizae. Does it do the plant any good? So we grew knapweed by itself, with and without mycorrhizae, killed all the fungus, and then we grew it in available phosphorus, in other words, that the plant can take up, and or unavailable, organic phosphorus. Has to have mycorrhizae if it's going to get that phosphorus right, or at least it's very difficult to get. And we wanted to see what mycorrhizae did for knapweed. Okay? Well, when knapweed's all by itself, where's my overhead? Oop, I got doing the wrong section here. When knapweed is all by itself, fungi don't do a dang thing. No big deal. It's loaded with mycorrhizae, but we couldn't find any positive, any good effect that these mycorrhizae had on knapweed when it was by itself. But the story was very, very different when it was with a native plant. The mycorrhizae changed the relationship with festuca, Idaho fescue, very much. And this is a weird thing, really weird thing. So let me reemphasize. The effect of mycorrhizae on knapweed, and actually on festuca, was very weak. The direct effect doesn't make much of a difference. But when you look at festucas that have been planted with knapweed, with and without mycorrhizae, there's a big difference. The festuca is, I can't do it this way. I was trying to make this a little more simple, but I cannot. Let's really focus up here on this upper panel, okay? Here's festuca biomass over here, okay? And these are festucas that have either been planted with other festucas, okay, in big pots, relatively small plants, big pots. If you guys can see, and here's the neighbor is Centaria, or knapweed, okay? This is with fungi, the black bars, with fungi, and this is without fungi. So with other festucas or fescues, makes no difference, no big deal. But if you stick it in there with the Centaria and the fungus, it gets hammered, okay? It's about a third the size as when there is no fungus. And we thought, wow, this is really weird. What's going on here? How is the fungus mediating the interaction? And we thought, okay, well, how does I'm not going to worry about the bottom panel here. Those are root-shoot ratios. But this suggests that the festuca gets hit very hard by the combination of the fungus and the knapweed. It's not the knapweed just beating up on the fescue. Okay, it's a knapweed doing something through the fungus to beat up on the fescue, at least maybe in addition to other things, maybe in addition to the root exudates. So, what about knapweed? Does knapweed, where is my, there we go. Does knapweed gain anything from being with the fescue? Now, I should point out in this first experiment, the fescues, we grew the fescues and the knapweeds at the same time. So the fescue was a little guy, the knapweed was a big guy. Okay, so we're dealing with, well, as you can see, a relatively big plant here. Okay, so this is, actually you'd have to look at the other graph, but the centaureas were larger. This is knapweed biomass, okay, either grown with a festuca, okay, or with a centaurea. It likes growing with festuca much better than it likes growing with others of its own ilk. And it did a little bit better when there were fungi around. Okay, so the festuca went down significantly, a lot, when there were fungi around, but the knapweed just, couldn't really tell much of a difference here. It wasn't a big deal. And we didn't know what was going on, but we thought, now maybe it needs a big festuca. Maybe we thought that the knapweed might actually be attaching to the fescue through the fungus and then sucking stuff out of the fescue. And we thought, well, if that's the case, okay, we don't know, but if that's the case, then maybe we should give it a big fescue. Okay, a big fescue that's really photosynthesizing a lot and providing a lot that can be sucked by the knapweed. Okay, so we did another experiment with much bigger fescues, planted them 8 weeks, sorry?
Just a question about that. Is that saying that the knapweed actually does better when it's with fescue than when it's with only knapweed?
Yes, the knapweeds that were grown with fescue were bigger than the ones that when they were grown with other knapweed, yeah. With another, two knapweeds, a knapweed competitor.
Getting something from the fescue.
Or maybe, we don't, not from this, we don't know that. You have to compare the dark and the light bars. But at least, maybe it's just because fescue is such a wimp that you stick knapweed in there and it just gets everything. Put it with another tough guy, a knapweed, and it has to share. But with festuca, maybe it doesn't have to. But it's this it's these bars that are kind of weird and suggest other things. So anyway, we tried the experiment again, Maryland, and got results that suggested exactly that. And we have this paper submitted now to a journal. Here's the biomass. Now this is a slightly different graph. Here's the biomass of the two plants. It's not the same arrangement. Here's biomass here. This is festuca biomass. Okay, remember this festuca was given a big head start. Here's the centaurea biomass. Okay, here's when there's fungus, here's when there's no fungus. When centaurea, and this doesn't make any sense if you just think about competition for resources, because now there's a big tough fescue in there. It should be a better competitor. But when there's fungi around, when there is fungi around, knapweed does about, about 40-45% better than when there's no fungus around. Okay, so in other words, it looks like the fungus may be giving that knapweed an advantage, and an advantage through what we think may be a parasitism. So we think knapweed is not only competing, but parasitizing native plants through the fungus. Okay, and we're trying to pursue this with other plants. Interesting thing, I found a paper in Nature, 1989, published by a well-known British scientist named Grime. And I brought the table, but it's a huge table, so it looks complicated. But what he did was, they have festucas, and they have centaureas there as well. He had these little tiny microcosm experiments. And the festuca there was the dominant competitor. Everybody else were the wimpy ones, the opposite of here. And he was asking different questions. But what he did was, he took away fungus, the mycorrhizae, or left it. And what he found was that when he took away fungus, the grass did much better without fungus, just like we found. Okay, that the festuca was bigger and the knapweed was a different centaurea nigra was much smaller, 10 times smaller, without the fungus. And then he put radioactive carbon into the festuca, and he found that only when mycorrhizae, when the fungi were present, 10 to 100 times more radioactive carbon showed up in Centaurea nigra. Okay, apparently transferred through the fungus. Same genera as we played with. Okay, again, I mean, it's circumstantial, but supports the idea that Centaurea may be doing something very, very weird. And it's not just an autotrophic, it's not just a photosynthesizing competitor out there, but that it's parasitizing its neighbors through fungi. Another interesting thing is there are thousands of parasitic plants in the world that don't directly parasitize other plants. They parasitize other plants through fungi. These plants, though, don't do very much photosynthesis. So there's knapweed may be something, who knows, this may be very common among plants. Plants may parasitize each other all the time through fungi. We don't know. Nobody knows yet. We will have a better idea soon. But these plants, and there are plants here in our forests that do this, that parasitize. They don't do any of their own photosynthesis, but they parasitize pine trees via connecting to the mycorrhizae, the fungus, and then sucking stuff out of the tree. So it's an indirect sort of parasitism. And we think knapweed may be doing that to native plants. So that's another direction that we're taking. Herbivory is also a big deal, like I mentioned. And I mentioned people have brought in at least 12 different insects to try to stop knapweed. And so we did some tests, and this might be interesting to you guys that want to control knapweed on your own land. We did some tests. This was Wendy Ridenour again, my first graduate student, out in the old Diederik Gardens to look at biocontrols. The biocontrols are anything biological rather than chemical spray used to try to suppress an invasive organism. So we looked at combinations, and we thought, we'll be really creative. We just won't look at one. We'll look at kind of interactions between controls, or between biocontrols. So here's some results, and they're kind of interesting. Here's Centaurea knapweed mass over here. This bar shows how big Centaurea got when it grew by itself, okay? And then this bar shows what happens when you apply a very widely used moth. The moth plants its eggs in the root collar of the knapweed. The larvae go down into the roots and chomp knapweed. So we thought, everybody thought this is going to be good, and they're spreading it all over the place. Okay, so this is agapita. It's a moth. Well, when agapita was put onto our plots, a little bit, nothing very significant. We also applied a fungus, a native fungus called sclerotinia. And a guy named Dave Sands at Bozeman is working with this. This wasn't our idea. He's developed it. We've just been monkeying with it. Well, these are the two bars for sclerotinia. Sclerotinia, within a couple of weeks, killed every knapweed, hundreds of knapweeds in all of our plots, every single one. So we never got to see the effect of agapita. So this fungus, this native fungus, was devastating to knapweed. The problem is it's difficult to apply. You got to get it right on the plant. But it's a very effective biological control when you can apply it right. So here are some consumers that have very contrasting effects on knapweed. Now, this is where it gets kind of weird. We decided, well, okay, so it does bad things to knapweed. Well, even this is maybe a little bit bad. But what we really want to know is what happens to the native plants, right? Well, knapweed, I mean, does this help the native plants to have knapweed knocked back a little bit?
What was it about the sclerotinia that was causing it to just completely kill the knapweed,
Sclerotinia, this I probably should have been a little bit more clear since I've been talking about other fungi. This is a completely different fungus. This is a consumer fungus. This is a fungus like that gets on dead things and eats it. So this fungus, I'm sorry, this is not mycorrhizal fungus at all. This thing, it grows all over the leaves, and just like you would eat a bagel, it eats the knapweed and consumes it. And maybe not just like it, but very close. So it's simply a consumer of the knapweed. But it has to have things just right. It's got to be kind of wet. It's very picky. So it worked good for us in those conditions. But what about, we use Festuca idahoensis again. What about Festuca? This is Festuca basal diameter, the width. This is over 2 years, the width of the bunch grass. And wow, Sclerotinia, the fungus was great. Here's the Sclerotinia. Here, well, let's start over here. Here's no biocontrols, no knapweed, just Festuca growing all by itself. It's nice and big. It's great. All right, you give it all of these now have knapweed in them, all 4 of these. And shoot, if you put the fungus on there, wham, kills all the knapweed. These guys are monsters. They're great. Agapita, let's see, this is Centaria, sorry, alone.